Hey everybody, Chris from Xano here, and I'm super excited today to share with you a brand new snippet for working with data from Typeform. This snippet includes two API endpoints. The first will actually auto-generate a brand new table for you with all of the appropriate schema to contain those responses from Typeform. And the second endpoint is actually more of a template that we can clone to actually process those incoming requests from our Typeform forms. In the first part of the video, I'm just going to show you how to install it and how to set it up so you can start using it right away. And then we'll go into a little bit more of a deep dive into how these function stacks work. So the first thing you're going to want to do is head to the snippet link in the description. We'll click add to your Xano account and we'll log in. You'll then be asked to choose which instance we want to install the snippet in. And we'll click add to instance. And you can click this button to go right back to your instance. I already have it open over here. So I'm going to go over here in the left-hand panel. We'll click Marketplace and Purchased. And you can see we now have this Typeform snippet here. We'll click on that and we'll choose Install Snippet and then Install down in the corner. So now we've installed the snippet, but we need to do a little bit of configuration to make sure that it works. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go over here into our settings. And in this environment variables section, we'll click manage. And the first thing we're going to populate is our workspace ID. And we can find that right in the URL for the workspace that we're currently in. For me, this is 31. I'm going to save that. And now we need to get an access token for the Xano Metadata API. If you're not familiar, the Metadata API is a set of API endpoints that allows you to programmatically manage content inside of your Xano instance. We're going to use the Metadata API to actually build the table and process those responses. So to do that, we're going to click our name down in the corner and we will click Account. Over here on the right-hand side, we have the Metadata API section. We'll click this Manage Access Tokens button. We'll click New Access Token, and we're just going to name this Demo Typeform. You can name this whatever you'd like. And we'll click Create. And now we're given an access token. We're only shown this once, so make sure to click the copy button here before you close this. And then we'll go back to our workspace. Back in the settings, we'll click Manage under Environment Variables again, and we're just going to paste that access token right in there and click Save. So now we've stored our environment variables. We can go over to the API section and click on the Typeform group. We have two API endpoints here. The first is called Create Typeform Table, and the second one is called Process Answer. For now, we're going to look at Create Typeform Table. You can see in my database, I have no tables yet. And what I can do is I can use this API endpoint to auto-generate a table for me that will contain all of the appropriate schema to hold the responses for my form. So I'm going to click this copy endpoint URL option up at the top, and then over in Typeform, we're going to go to connect and then webhooks. We'll click add a webhook, and we're going to paste our endpoint URL in there, and we'll click save. And so now what we want to do is we want to turn on the webhook, and we actually need to go over to the form and fill out a sample submission. Now, if you are super familiar with Typeform, you may be aware of this option to send a test request. In my experience, now granted, I'm not a daily Typeform user, so this may be different for you. Sending a test request did not actually send the entirety of all of the questions I had in my form. I'm not sure if that's expected behavior, but for me, it worked a lot better to just go to my form and fill out a sample response. After we send that test submission through our form, we can go right back to the database tab. And there is our table. Our API took that form response, processed all of the different answer types, and then used the metadata API to build the table with the exact schema that we need. The table name comes from the name of the form, and the field names come from the question content. So if you have a question that says, hello, what's your name? That's what the field will be called. The API does have handling for certain situations where maybe your question does not have a name. It's just going to give it a default name. In the descriptions for each field, we have the ID of the corresponding question. This is used later on in the endpoint that actually processes the answers. Same with the description for the table, we have the ID of the entire form. So in terms of setting up the table to hold the responses, that's really all there is to it. Now, if you already have a table established to hold your responses, you could potentially leverage this snippet as building blocks to do what you need to do, but I am ultimately going to recommend that you start with a fresh table. So let's go over to the API, and we're going to take a look at this process answer endpoint. So this endpoint is the one that actually takes the answers from your Typeform. We're going to click these three dots up at the top and choose clone, and we'll give this a new name. I just like to give it the same name as my form. So we'll save that. In this cloned endpoint, we're going to scroll all the way down to the bottom, and we'll click this plus sign here, and we're going to add a new step. This is going to be under database requests and add record, and we'll choose that new table that was created by the previous endpoint. Click this little magic wand icon up here in the panel that opens and choose the record object variable. We'll click save down at the bottom. We'll publish our changes. Copy the endpoint URL from the menu up at the top. We'll go back to Typeform. You may need to refresh the screen if you're still on the sample response page. We'll go ahead and add a new webhook. Paste the URL in there, click Save Webhook, and we'll turn it on. Make sure to turn off the webhook that you added previously to generate the table. We're not going to need that anymore. And that's really all we need to do. Go ahead and head back to your form and fill out a new submission. Okay, so we filled out our form again. Let's go to the database and we'll head back into that table, and you can see we now have the response that we just submitted as a test. We can scroll all the way over and we can see all of those answers to the questions that were provided in our form. So your type form is now sending those requests to Xano, and they are being stored in the table. So everything's working great, and Typeform is now sending those responses to us, and they're being stored in our Xano database. Let's take a look at the function stacks, and we can see how these work. So both of these endpoints are what we call webhooks. A webhook is a little bit different from a normal API in the way that it processes the inputs. So the inputs are any data that's being sent to the API so it can do what it's supposed to do. A webhook in Xano always starts with a get all input function. And this is located under utility functions right here. So this just gets the entirety of the input that's being sent to this API and stores it in a variable. The next step of the function stack takes that entire input that Typeform has sent, and it specifically gets the responses out of that input. And you can actually see what this looks like. I can give you a quick example here. We can see all of those questions that were sent and some additional data about the form. You can also see this in Typeform. If you click on any of your webhooks, you can actually look at all of the deliveries that were sent to your APIs, and you can get an idea of what's being sent there. So we get the input and we get the responses out of that input. Step 3 is a create variable that contains some data about each of the different field types that Typeform will send. This allows us to dynamically generate the schema for our table when we call the Metadata API. The next few steps also have to do with getting the data that we need to call the Metadata API. So we get our Xano instance URL, we get the Metadata API URL, and finally our workspace ID from that environment variable. The next two steps generate a starter variable that will contain the schema for the table. And then finally, we have a for each loop on all of the fields that Typeform is sending, so we can process those one at a time and build the schema that we need. So the first thing we do is we search that question types variable that was created in step 3 to find the appropriate schema for the field that we need to build in the Xano database based on the question type. We then do a little bit of data transformation on the question name to make sure that it can be used as a field name in Xano. We then build the final schema for that table, and we check to make sure that the name is not empty, just in case you have a question in Typeform that does not actually have a question, and maybe it has just answers. We wanted to make sure to prepare for as many scenarios as possible. And then finally, when we're all done, we verified the name, we've built the schema, we add that schema to a new variable that will be used in the final API request, which happens down here after this loop completes, to the metadata API, providing the name, description, and finally that schema for the table. So it looks like a lot, but it's really not super complicated. We just get the response from Typeform, we establish a whole bunch of variables, we loop through those questions, we build the schema, and then finally we send it to the metadata API, and that's what generates the table in Xano. So let's take a look at the other API, which actually processes the form responses. So in this API, which is again a webhook, so we start off with get all input. We then establish a couple of variables that we need to work with the metadata API. In step 4, we're actually calling the metadata API right away. And what we're doing is we're getting a list of all of the tables that we have available. We then use an array find first element function. And the purpose of this function is to look at the list of tables returned by the metadata API and to find the table that corresponds with the form ID that Typeform has just sent us. Remember, in that table, we have the form ID in the description. So we're looking for the table that has that ID in the description. And then we call the metadata API again to get specific data related to that table. We then establish an empty variable called the record object, which just contains the answers that are being submitted from Typeform. And then we loop through those answers, again using array find first element to find the corresponding table field that is returned from the API request in step 6. We then have a few conditionals based on the type of answer being returned. We then have a few conditional steps to determine how to behave based on the type of answer that's currently being looped through. A lot of them have very similar behaviors, such as text and email, phone numbers, and dates. However, for things like multiple choice and incoming file attachments, we do need a couple of different things to happen there. As an example, if someone is uploading a file in your Typeform, we need to use a create file resource and a create attachment step to generate the metadata for that file before it can be stored in your Xano database. We use the attachment field here because that can basically handle any file type, as opposed to trying to also determine, is this an image? Is this audio? Is this a PDF? We just use an attachment field, so it works for everything right away. And finally, at the end, we don't have anything else, and that's because this endpoint, remember, is more of a template. We actually need to add the final add record step. And that's only because this specific step cannot be generated dynamically. You want to make sure to add the add record step after you clone this endpoint. But then that's it. That's the whole thing. So it's pretty similar to the generate table endpoint, but maybe a little bit less complicated, where we're just getting the input, establishing a few variables, we're finding the table that corresponds to the form that's being submitted. And then finally, we loop through those answers and construct the data in the way that we need, which typically just involves a name and a value. And then finally, at the bottom, we would have that add record step to add the response to our table. Thanks so much for watching. I really hope this snippet is helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them down in the comments below. You can also visit us on the Xano community or reach out to us via support chat inside of Xano. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.